The year was 1933, and the streets of Harlem were as dangerous as ever. The city was crawling with gangsters, street soldiers, and would-be kings, all fighting for a slice of the pie in a world that was unforgiving and brutal. But among them stood one man who had managed to not only survive, but thrive: Bumpy Johnson. On one fateful evening, the air in Harlem felt different, charged like the calm before a storm. The usual hum of activity in the streets was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. Inside a rundown speakeasy in the heart of the district, Bumpy sat at a corner table, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The walls around him were stained with the history of Harlem's criminal past, and the flickering light above cast deep shadows across the faces of the men seated around him. These were his men, the loyal ones who had stayed by his side through thick and thin. But tonight, something felt off. "Bumpy," Leroy said, his voice low and tense. "You don't look like yourself." Bumpy didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His grip tightened around the glass of whiskey in front of him, the amber liquid catching the light. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when everything he had built, the empire of Harlem he had carved out from the streets, was about to face its greatest challenge. Outside, a new breed of criminals had started to make a name for themselves. Gangs from the Lower East Side and the Bronx were making moves into Harlem's turf. They were young, reckless, and most dangerous of all, they weren't afraid to spill blood to make their mark. But Bumpy wasn't just any gangster. He had earned his place at the top with his sharp mind and iron will. No one was going to take Harlem from him, not tonight. The door to the speakeasy creaked open, and a tall, well-dressed man entered. He was a stranger to Bumpy, but his walk and the way the room immediately grew tense told him all he needed to know. This wasn't just some street punk looking to make a name for himself. This was someone with serious backing, someone who could pose a real threat to Bumpy's reign. "You must be Bumpy Johnson," the man said with a hint of respect and wariness. His accent marked him as an outsider from the other side of town, but Bumpy knew better than to trust anyone based on first impressions. "Name's Johnny Rossetti. I think it's time we talked business." Bumpy didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Rossetti's. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. "Business?" Bumpy repeated, his voice low, almost a growl. "I've been running business in Harlem for years, so unless you've got something new to offer, you'd best turn around and walk out of here." Rossetti smirked, undeterred. "I've got something you might be interested in. Capone's looking to expand into Harlem. We're offering you a partnership. You stay in charge of the streets, and we bring the muscle and the resources to make it bigger than anything you've ever seen." At the mention of Capone's name, Bumpy's eyes narrowed. He'd heard whispers about the Italians making a play for Harlem, but he hadn't taken it seriously. Al Capone was a name that commanded respect, but to Bumpy, it was just another challenge to overcome. The Italians may have controlled Chicago, but Harlem was his. It always had been. "You think Capone can just waltz into my city and take over?" Bumpy's voice was cold, filled with venom. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Johnny Rossetti's smirk faded slightly, but he didn't back down. "You're not going to be able to fight this forever, Bumpy. The world's changing, and Capone's got the muscle to back up his deals. He's offering you something better than what you've got." Bumpy didn't blink. "Let me make something clear, Johnny," he said, his voice now firm and resolute. "This is my city, my empire, and anyone who tries to take it from me will regret it. You tell Capone that. You tell him Bumpy Johnson doesn't share." With that, Bumpy stood up, the movement sharp and deliberate. The room seemed to close in around them. The message had been sent, clear and unambiguous. Bumpy Johnson would not be intimidated. He would not back down. Not from anyone, and certainly not from some outsider looking to take what was his. Rossetti, realizing that his approach had failed, straightened up. "You'll regret this, Johnson," he said, his voice laced with barely contained anger. Capone doesn't take rejection lightly. I'm not worried about Capone, Bumpy said coldly. I've survived worse than him. The tension in the room lingered as Rossetti turned and walked out, leaving Bumpy to face his men. They knew what was coming. Bumpy's reputation had always been one of unrelenting force, and the streets of Harlem were about to feel the full weight of that. Bumpy Johnson had always known that the streets were a battleground. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he had learned early on that life was about survival. Harlem, in the 1920s and 1930s, was the epitome of both opportunity and danger. It was a place where anyone could rise, but it was also a place where the slightest misstep could lead to a violent fall. By the time Bumpy arrived in Harlem, it was already a hub for criminal activity, with gangs running numbers, gambling, and bootlegging operations. The neighborhood was a melting pot of cultures, and Bumpy, already a skilled hustler, quickly recognized the potential. He worked his way up from small-time crime to become a player in the numbers racket, a lucrative business that operated in plain sight but required a sharp mind to control. In 1933, at the height of Prohibition, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as one of Harlem's most powerful men. His connections ran deep, from the streets to the highest echelons of the city's political and law enforcement structures. He wasn't just feared, he was respected. His ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Harlem's underworld made him a force to be reckoned with. But power in Harlem was always fleeting. The streets were filled with rival factions, gangsters looking for any opportunity to move up, and the constant pressure of law enforcement and outside organizations trying to push in. As the city changed, so too did the dynamics of power. The Mafia, led by figures like Al Capone, began to encroach on Harlem's territory, eyeing the profits of the numbers racket and the booming drug trade. Bumpy, however, had something the Mafia didn't: an intimate understanding of Harlem's people and the complex, shifting alliances that defined the streets. Harlem, in the 1930s, was more than just a neighborhood. It was a symbol, a place where the black community could claim power in a city that often ignored them. For Bumpy, Harlem wasn't just his territory. It was his legacy. He had fought tooth and nail to build his empire, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially the Mafia, take it from him. The offer from Capone's men, however, was a reminder that the world was changing, and Bumpy was no longer the only player on the field. The Mafia had the money, the muscle, and the connections to take over, and Bumpy knew that. But he also knew that he wasn't a man to be bought or intimidated. He had survived the most dangerous streets of New York by relying on his own instincts and keeping his enemies in check. Now, in 1933, the test was about to come. The real challenge for Bumpy wasn't the Mafia. It was the men around him, his crew, his allies, his friends. Because in a world like Harlem's, loyalty was always in question. The more power you accumulated, the more enemies you made, and the more fragile your position became. The real question for Bumpy was whether his own men could be trusted to stand by him when the Mafia came knocking. Would they follow him into the fight, or would they see the offer from Capone's men as a chance to make a deal for themselves? Bumpy's world had always been built on one simple principle: loyalty. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about the trust that bound him to his crew, his men, and the community he had fought to protect. But as the whispers of the Mafia's offer spread through Harlem, the foundations of that loyalty began to crack. The streets that had once been ruled by a single, unchallenged king were now becoming a battleground of divided loyalties and shifting alliances. The news of Capone's involvement in Harlem wasn't just a threat to Bumpy's power, it was a challenge to everything he had worked for. The Mafia had the muscle to back up their words, but Bumpy had something they didn't: the streets. Harlem wasn't just a territory to him, it was a way of life. He had built his empire with blood, sweat, and intelligence, and he wasn't going to let anyone tear it down without a fight. But that fight was going to require more than just muscle. It was going to require a full understanding of who he could trust. In the days following his meeting with Johnny Rossetti, Bumpy grew increasingly paranoid. It wasn't the Mafia that worried him the most. It was his own crew. Leroy, Tony, and the others had always been loyal, but the Mafia's money and promises of protection had begun to stir something dangerous in the air. Bumpy could feel the tension rising, the unease creeping into the hearts of his men. How many of them would stay loyal when the money and power that Capone offered became too tempting? The first sign that things were unraveling came when Tony, one of Bumpy's closest allies, came to him with an offer. Tony had always been one of the most trusted men in Bumpy's crew, but now, with the Mafia moving in, he seemed less sure of his position. "Bumpy, we need to talk," Tony said one night after the rest of the crew had left. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as he sat across from Bumpy in their usual meeting spot. "What's on your mind?" Bumpy asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. He already had a feeling about where this conversation was headed. "I've been thinking," Tony began, his eyes darting around the room. "Capone's got a lot of influence. We could work with him, you know? It'd be good for business. We wouldn't have to deal with all the pressure from the cops and the rival gangs. It could be the right move, Bumpy." Bumpy's jaw clenched, and his fists tightened around the edges of the chair. He had seen this before, the way men who had been loyal to him could be swayed by money. It wasn't just about business, it was about power. And Tony, his trusted ally, was already showing signs of being tempted by the promise of something more. "Tony, you've been with me through all of this," Bumpy said slowly, his voice edged with a warning. "You know how I built this. You know what we stand for. So don't talk to me about making deals with Capone. You're better than that." Tony looked away, his face conflicted. "I'm just trying to think about the future, Bumpy. We can't keep doing things the old way. Times are changing." Bumpy stood up, his presence filling the room. The air between them crackled with tension. "I've survived on these streets longer than anyone else, and I'll be damned if I let some outsider walk in here and take what's mine," he said firmly. "You tell Capone that if he wants Harlem, he's going to have to go through me, and if you want to be on the other side of that fight, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were." Tony flinched at Bumpy's words. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions: betrayal, doubt, fear. It was clear that the stakes were higher than either of them had anticipated. Bumpy's empire was built on loyalty, but loyalty was no longer a guarantee, and Tony, standing in front of him, was the first to break it. Tony's face hardened, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, and Bumpy stood there, alone. The reality of the situation had hit him hard. He had always known that power was fleeting, but now it was staring him in the face. His empire was crumbling from within, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold it together. It wasn't just the Mafia that threatened Bumpy's world. It was his own men, his own crew. Trust, once his most valuable asset, had become a fragile thing. His men were torn between the old loyalty they had to him and the promise of something new, something bigger. That night, Bumpy sat in his office, alone with his thoughts. He could hear the sounds of the street outside, the muffled conversations, the occasional car passing by. Harlem was alive, but it was changing, and so was he. The man who had built his empire from nothing had become a king, but kings could fall. And Bumpy wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. Bumpy's worst fears were realized when word came through that one of his old allies, Leroy, had been seen meeting with the Mafia. Leroy, the man who had been with Bumpy since the beginning, the man who had fought alongside him through thick and thin, was now in the hands of the enemy. It was the final straw. Bumpy knew what he had to do. The Mafia had crossed a line and his men had betrayed him. There was no turning back now. He had to act, and he had to act fast. The confrontation took place on a cold night in early December, in a secluded alley near one of Harlem's old warehouses. The air was thick with mist, the sound of footsteps muffled on the wet pavement. Bumpy and his men stood in the shadows, waiting for Leroy to arrive. Bumpy's mind was clear, his focus sharp. He had made his decision. Leroy had made his choice. And now, there would be consequences. When Leroy finally appeared, his face pale and drawn, Bumpy's men stepped forward, surrounding him. There was no turning back now. Leroy had chosen his side, and it wasn't Bumpy's. "You think you can just walk away from all of this, Leroy?" Bumpy's voice cut through the silence. "You think you can sell me out to the Mafia and get away with it?" Leroy's eyes flickered with fear, but he didn't speak. He knew what was coming. "You've been with me from the start. You know what loyalty means," Bumpy continued, his voice growing colder with every word. "But you've made your choice, Leroy, and now you'll face the consequences." The tension was unbearable. Leroy's eyes darted from Bumpy to the men standing around him. He knew the rules of the streets, and he knew that Bumpy had always been a man of his word. Without another word, Bumpy motioned to his men. Leroy's fate had been sealed. The aftermath of Leroy's betrayal was swift. Word spread quickly through Harlem. Bumpy Johnson had sent a message, loud and clear. Betrayal was not tolerated, and even the closest allies could find themselves on the wrong side of Bumpy's justice. The news of Leroy's demise shook the streets of Harlem. Some feared it, others respected it. For Bumpy, it was a necessary act, a painful one, but one that had to be done to maintain control. His empire was built on loyalty, and without it, it would crumble. But even as Bumpy dealt with betrayal within his own ranks, the message he sent out to the world was just as clear. Harlem was his. The Mafia may have tried to muscle in, but they had underestimated him. The streets, once again, belonged to Bumpy Johnson. The brutal resolution of Leroy's betrayal reverberated through Harlem like a storm. The streets, once filled with murmurs and quiet whispers, were now alive with the unmistakable echo of Bumpy Johnson's decisiveness. The news traveled fast. Bumpy had acted swiftly, and the message was as clear as it was unyielding. Loyalty was everything, and if you crossed Bumpy, there would be no mercy. The act of justice, while harsh, was a powerful testament to Bumpy's rule. No one dared question his leadership anymore. His empire, which had once been a series of fractured alliances and tenuous agreements, was now solidified under one banner, his own. The men who remained by his side saw the consequences of betrayal firsthand, and they respected him for it. They had always known Bumpy as a man who stood tall and held his ground, but now they saw the extent to which he would go to maintain order. The fallout from Leroy's death reverberated throughout Harlem and beyond. While some in the streets feared Bumpy's wrath, others revered him for his power and unyielding control. He had proven once again that he was a man of his word, a man who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his rule. And it wasn't just the criminals who took note. The politicians, the cops, and even the businessmen knew who controlled the streets. Bumpy's name, once whispered in hushed tones, was now spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. But even with his enemies cowed, Bumpy could feel the tide of change. The Mafia, though temporarily pushed back, was not finished. They would regroup, reorganize, and return with more force. The law enforcement, while intimidated, still held their grip on parts of the city. And the young men rising up from the streets, eager for power, began to challenge the old ways of doing things. As the months passed, Bumpy continued to command the respect of Harlem. But the threats were no longer just from his rivals. The political landscape was shifting, and with it, the criminal world was changing. The streets were becoming more dangerous in different ways. New players, new opportunities, and a new generation of criminals were emerging. Bumpy, always a man of action, knew that he couldn't remain static. He had to evolve or be left behind. Yet no matter what came next, Bumpy's reputation remained unscathed. He had faced down the Mafia and emerged victorious. He had dealt with betrayal at the hands of one of his closest allies and shown the streets that he was a man who could be trusted with power. Harlem was still his, and as long as his name carried weight, so too would his legacy. His reign, built on the foundation of loyalty, had survived the most dangerous streets of New York City. But even Bumpy knew that nothing lasts forever. As the years wore on, he would face even greater challenges. But this moment, this stand against the Mafia and the betrayal of his own men, cemented his place in history as a man who understood the true cost of power and how to maintain it. In the wake of these trials, Bumpy's name would become synonymous with survival. He had seen the worst that the streets had to offer, and he had come out on top. And as long as there were streets to walk and men to command, Bumpy Johnson would remain a figure to be reckoned with. Bumpy Johnson's story in 1933 wasn't just about the survival of one man. It was about the survival of a way of life. Harlem, with all its grit, ambition, and power, was a place that didn't forgive weakness. Bumpy's rise to the top wasn't just about criminal acumen. It was about the ability to navigate a world where trust could be fleeting, loyalty could be bought, and the price of betrayal was steep. Through every challenge, Bumpy remained unbroken. He survived the most dangerous streets of New York City, not by making deals or bending the rules, but by defining the rules himself. His response to betrayal, his ability to take down a man who had once been like family, was a testament to his strength. His unwillingness to let anything threaten the kingdom he had built. In the end, Bumpy's legacy was cemented not by the wealth or the power he accumulated, but by the respect he commanded. Even when faced with the most dangerous of circumstances, he held his ground. For Bumpy Johnson, the streets weren't just a place to survive. They were a place to thrive, to conquer, and to ensure that his name would be remembered forever. As his empire grew and as the world around him changed, one thing remained certain. Bumpy Johnson's story was one of survival. Surviving betrayal, surviving the Mafia, surviving the deadly streets of New York. It was a story of power, loyalty, and above all, respect. This wasn't just about one man's rise to power. This was about understanding the cost of survival and the price of loyalty. In the dangerous world of Harlem, it was Bumpy who set the rules, and it was Bumpy who proved that no matter what the world threw at him, he would always stand tall.